Capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolás Maduro. We have now learned today he is set to make his first court appearance in New York City as soon as tomorrow, according to what a court spokesperson tells NBC News. You're looking at some of those new images of Maduro here with Today in Venezuela, people picking up the pieces. Literally, this new video coming into us after the U.S. struck Venezuela, capturing both Maduro and his wife in this surprise military operation unlike anything we've seen in a generation. Both Maduro and his wife are facing drug and weapons charges here in the U.S. This is another picture of him. He's appearing in handcuffs next to DEA agents right here. You see him obviously in that blue sweatshirt. We're also seeing this new picture of Celia Flores, his wife, at a New York City heliport last night. And new today, we are also hearing from the Secretary of State, who says while the U.S. is not at war with Venezuela, American troops will stay in the region as, in his words, leverage.
The first steps are securing what's in the national interest of the United States and also beneficial to the people of Venezuela. And those are the things that we're focused on right now. No more drug trafficking, no more Iran, Hezbollah presence there, and no more using the oil industry to enrich all our adversaries.
Big questions now remain ahead, including who is in charge in Venezuela, how will the U.S. work with that interim Venezuelan government, and what it means that, as President Trump says, the U.S. will run the country for the foreseeable future, especially with the leaders in Venezuela now sounding defiant, at least publicly. There's the question of if and when we could see even more of a military escalation. President Trump says he is not ruling out putting troops on the ground there. And then, of course, the domestic pushback here at home, with some lawmakers calling the extraction of Maduro illegal, with concerns the U.S. could get drawn into a protracted conflict. We have team coverage here today. Valerie Castro standing by outside the detention center where Maduro is being held in New York. Our Meet the Press moderator, Kristen Welker, is with us, too. But I want to start with Julie Sirkin, along with Keir Simmons. Julie is traveling with the president in West Palm Beach, Florida. She is joining us now. And Julie, this is a significant day in the Trump administration. One day after, right, that extraction of Maduro, President Trump is finishing up his holiday break. But we did hear from Secretary of State Rubio this morning laying out what he sees as the next steps.
Exactly right. We heard from the Secretary of State, who spoke to our Kristen Welker, justifying the operation that the administration is referring to as audacious that took place overnight on Friday. The president, for his part, is spending the day at his golf club before flying back to Washington, D.C. later tonight. It was after a long night in which he had watched this operation unfold from a secure room in Mar-a-Lago. We saw pictures of that come through being posted by the president yesterday. But we are hearing a significant defense of the criticism that the administration is now facing, mostly from Democrats, also from some in the MAGA base, questioning why it seems that the U.S. is escalating its military power, escalating perhaps and taking this step in Venezuela. The Vice President, J.D. Vance, who we are told did not watch the operation from Mar-a-Lago, he was not in that space for security reasons. He posted on X, Hallie, a significant defense of this operation, of the fact that they had to go in there for narco-terrorism and drug reasons, saying about 20 years ago, Venezuela expropriated American oil property and until recently used that property to get rich. He went on to say, great powers don't act like that. And that is why he said the administration took this step, Hallie.
And Julie, we're also getting some new details on sort of the TikTok, as they call it, the minute by minute of how this operation unfolded.
Yeah, the whole operation, Hallie, took about a little over 2 hours. We know the president ordered the operation, according to what he told myself and other reporters yesterday, in Mar-a-Lago at 10:46 p.m. on Friday. The weather conditions were just right. This is something they had prepared for, Hallie, for months. They had prepared in executing plans for this operation. Of course, it was extremely risky. No U.S. service members were killed. There were some that were injured, but I'm told by a White House official that they are in stable condition. The president, as I mentioned, watched this operation unfold with some of his closest cabinet members. And we also now know that the CIA played a heavy hand in this before the military became involved for months, essentially looking at Maduro's movements, even so far as tracking his pets, according to General Dan Kane and what he told us yesterday. And we also know that the CIA had a human source, at least one, inside Maduro's circle. That is how they were able to get so precise. 150 different aircraft circling Venezuela just moments before military personnel went into the ground in Caracas and ultimately took over Maduro, took him out and his wife, and transported them to the U.S., where we saw those images that you showed of them being processed last night. So certainly certainly there is a long road ahead, many questions, including what U.S. running the country, as the president said, will look like. And the administration, presumably today, is spending that time trying to figure it out and build all those pieces out, Hallie.
Julie Sirkin, thanks. Let me get to our Meet the Press moderator, Kristen Welker, who is joining us now. And Kristen, a busy morning for you, having that conversation with the Secretary of State on regime change, on this idea of troops in the region as leverage. Explain that, Kristen, and based on your analysis, how you see the next couple of days playing out, especially with some of this domestic pushback here at home from some of the critics of the president's move.
Yeah, great question, Hallie. Look, Secretary Rubio was clear at this point in time, there aren't boots on the ground inside Venezuela, but that is still very much an open possibility, underscored the fact that they expect officials in Venezuela to cooperate with the U.S. government. And I think there are a number of key questions. And one of the big ones, Hallie, revolves around timeline. I asked Secretary Rubio effectively, how long is this transition going to last? When will elections be held? And Hallie, it was really notable. He said he believes it's premature to be talking about the issue of elections right now because effectively this transition is just getting underway. I really tried to pin him down on who exactly is running Venezuela. Is he running Venezuela as the Secretary of State? And notably, after I pressed him a couple of different times, he said, yes, of course, he is involved, but he pointed to the fact that the entire national security team is playing a role at the same time. And to that big question, is the United States effectively at war with Venezuela? He said, no, absolutely not. But he did say the U.S. is at war with narco-terrorists, that this is effectively a message and should be seen as a message to other leaders. And then, Hallie, I pressed him on the history of this, the fact that historically speaking, America does not have a good track record when it comes to going into taking over other countries. Take a listen to a little bit of that exchange. Regime change, historically speaking, has not gone very well for the United States. In Iraq, in Libya, to name a few examples. Can you assure Americans, the people of the United States, that this time will be different?
Well, here's what's happened. We've got this phobia built up and this sort of thing that's psyche. Number one, Venezuela looks nothing like Libya. It looks nothing like Iraq. It looks nothing like Afghanistan. It looks nothing like the Middle East other than the Iranian agents that are running through there plotting against America. Okay? These are Western countries with long traditions among their at a people-to-people and cultural level and ties to the United States. So there's nothing like that. Number two, this is about the national interest of the United States. And what I'm confident of is we are in a safer and better place because we're taking it seriously.
Hallie, you also asked about the president's allies, the reaction on Capitol Hill largely falling at this point along party lines. Democrats, including leader Jeffries, who I interviewed today on Meet the Press, saying that while he believes that Nicolás Maduro is a thug who deserves to be deposed, he believes the administration went about it in the wrong way because they did not consult with Congress. Republicans broadly supportive of this move. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, though, a part of the president's MAGA base, who of course had that extraordinary split with President Trump, sharply critical of this move, essentially saying this is the Washington playbook the American people are so sick and tired of, saying that the president's more focused on foreign policy than domestic issues like affordability. Hallie, does she represent a broader crack within the MAGA base? At this point, it doesn't seem so. It seems as though the MAGA base is still standing largely behind him. But will that continue to be true if the U.S. involvement in Venezuela stretches on? Hallie?
Kristen Welker, much to follow on that front. We're glad to have you with us today, Kristen. Thank you. Let me bring in now our correspondent who is posted up in Brooklyn, New York, outside the detention center where Maduro is being held, Valerie Castro, who is joining us now. Give us a sense of the scene here, Valerie, because we know that there are some groups who are gathering to protest his capture, even as we've also seen many Venezuelans and Venezuelan Americans celebrating the end of his dictatorship in Venezuela.
Yeah, Hallie, and the largest protest group that was here actually just broke up within the last few minutes, but it was a group of about 40 to 50 people, as you said, protesting the U.S. actions that were taken in Venezuela in just the last day or so. They were calling for Maduro's release. They say they are against the U.S. getting involved in any sort of foreign conflict with Venezuela. Take a listen to what woman had to say, arguing that this is really not about liberty for the Venezuelan people. Take a listen.
Trump said he's going to run the country. We know that money is never going to go to the Venezuelan people. It's going to go into the pockets of these CEOs of these oil companies, and that's who's going to benefit from all of this, not the American people here who have been struggling economically for a really long time.
Again, those protest groups just broke up within the last few minutes or so, but they were largely here across the street, right across from the Metropolitan Detention Center where Maduro was brought late last night. He was delivered here in Manhattan by helicopter, then eventually brought here to this detention center where he will await his court hearing in the next day or so. Hallie?
And do you notice any kind of elevated security posture at this detention center, Valerie? Had there been people coming by to try to get a look at it for themselves? I'm curious about the sense of scene where you are.
There are some people coming by to take a look, rather small groups at this point, I should say. The NYPD has placed barricades, kind of just to section off the media and give them a safe place to stand, as well as the protest groups. They've kind of cordoned people off across the street. But there have been high-profile defendants here at the Metropolitan Detention Center. One who is currently here besides Maduro is Luigi Mangione, the man accused of murdering United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. Ghislaine Maxwell was held here during a time Sean Diddy Combs also spent several months here awaiting during the duration of his trial. So a lot of high-profile people. This is a federal detention center, people facing federal charges. Hallie?
Valerie Castro live for us there in Brooklyn. Valerie, thank you very much. We're going to talk in just a moment about that apparent court date that could be as soon as tomorrow for Maduro. But I want to take you first to Venezuela here, because we are now today, brand new, just into us, getting a closer look at the scale of the destruction from the attack on Venezuela, the extraction of Maduro. You heard Julie Sirkin and others lay out what exactly happened. 150 military aircraft from the U.S. coming in, landing. There was obviously fire exchange. This was the scene you're looking at right here in one of the places targeted. You can see some damage now at what appeared to be a residential complex. Just really rubble here. I want to bring you the view on the ground inside Venezuela with journalist Ana Vanessa Herrero. She's based in the capital of Caracas. Ana watched the attack happen in real time. Ana, thank you very much for being back with us again. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay. Well, you and I spoke yesterday, and you described this feeling of uncertainty among many Venezuelans that you were talking with. Long lines at supermarkets, long lines at pharmacies as people were sort of scrambling in the hours after the attack. Here we are now, day two, effectively. Give us a sense of what you're seeing on the ground. If you still have us, Ana.
But I don't know if you. I think I lost you, but I don't know if you're listening.
You're good.
Hearing me. Are you hearing me?
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I was telling you that what we're experiencing today, it's a little bit of what we saw yesterday, but calmer. So less people on the streets, but less lines, moving faster. People wondering still how much they should get. More supermarkets and pharmacies opening to welcome the people who want to stock whatever they need for the hours and the days to come. And it's interesting because while we're seeing that footage, I actually visited one place that was also affected by one of the several bombings here in Caracas. And I was talking to the owners, I was talking to the neighbors, and they were telling me, why would the United States attack a residential area or somewhere near a residential area if they're not military targets? Although this place that I'm talking about is near a communication tower that served for the military. So they were wondering, and even one of them said, we want to ask the United States to help us rebuild our house because this is not our fault and we somehow got affected. So right now, today, we're seeing more people trying to understand what happened and really getting all that in.
What about the leadership in Venezuela right now? Because the Venezuelan Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, we've talked about her quite a bit here. She was obviously at Maduro's side for quite a while. She's now serving as interim president. She has struck, at least publicly, a defiant tone, insisting multiple times that there is only one president of Venezuela, and it is Nicolás Maduro. What is your sense of who the Venezuelan people that you're talking with want to see take power? We know that President Trump has largely dismissed the idea of the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, taking over. Give me a sense of what you're hearing on that front.
Well, believe it or not, people are not talking about that. I mean, the conversation here on the ground is not revolving around who is next in line. If Delcy Rodriguez is going to, for example, which would be a very good question to ask, if she's going to follow the Maduro's line, if she's going to be as harsh as he was repressing protests, for example, if they erupt. That is not a key element right now among the people I've talked to. They're not even talking about Maria Corina Machado anymore. People in lines are talking about how much water do we need if another strike comes. What should I do? Should I get refuge? Should I seek shelter? Should I get my family? Should I travel? And then this intensifies after defense minister just ordered basically Venezuela to get back to normal immediately. And people wonder, how are we going to get back to normal after experiencing such a day as Saturday, starting with bombing the capital city of Caracas, ending with Nicolás Maduro on handcuffs. An image that keeps being present in everyone's mind, at least here on the ground. So I think there's a little bit of confusion, because you would expect people, here to wonder and talk about who's next and if Delcy's going to be the president for how long, or elections even, right? But that is not the case. And I think the citizens of the people here are still in a state of shock. And I think it's going to take a little bit of time to get out of that.
Just briefly, Anna, because what you're describing, it does seem to make sense that the immediate need of people is their livelihood, is their food, their water, their shelter, those basic needs that have to be fulfilled before they can talk about kind of the next element, the next layer politically of things. Would you say then, Anna, that people are in any sense getting the answers that they're looking for when it comes to those questions of basic necessities?
Well, yes and no. I mean, we have not seen lootings or chaos in the streets. We are not seeing people or pharmacies or supermarkets without any products on the shelves. I mean, this is not a scenario like the ones we saw back in 2016, when people couldn't find anything to survive. This is different. The supermarkets are still stuck, but people do wonder if this is going to become a major humanitarian crisis. And if that is the case, then what is next? So people, for example, a woman today, while she was buying some stuff, she said, if another strike happens, then what about the transportation of food from one place to the other in the country? I mean, things are going to get more expensive. It's going to be harder to get food, to get water. So she was basically buying anything she could. And still, she could find stuff.
Okay. Ana Vanessa Herrera, we're so glad to have you on the ground there in Venezuela. Thank you for your continued reporting under what I know are tough circumstances for you and those around you. Really appreciate your time. Let's bring it back here to home now, because potentially as soon as tomorrow, so less than 24 hours from now, we could see Nicolás Maduro and his wife make their first court appearance in New York City. We showed you that detention center where he's being held now in Brooklyn. He's facing multiple criminal charges here in the U.S. Narco-terrorism conspiracy, the importation of a whole lot of cocaine, conspiracy on that front, multiple gun charges as well. You can see them here all laid out in that sweeping indictment that accuses Maduro of essentially partnering with cartels to initiate this massive drug trafficking conspiracy. I want to bring in for more our Chief Justice and National Affairs correspondent, Kelly O'Donnell. So with that stage set, Kelly, for tomorrow, we saw action for almost 18 hours straight yesterday. The capture, the attack on Venezuela, the capture of Maduro, his extraction back to the United States, him landing at that airport in New York, choppering to New York City, all of that. Today, he is behind closed doors. Tomorrow, that may change.
So really, you set that up in a beautiful way, because the extraordinary cinematic events that were high stakes and high danger that led to his arrest and capture will now be followed by a far more predictable process inside the United States justice system. A figure of the world notoriety, such as Maduro, certainly will continue to draw a great deal of attention to that holding facility in New York, which has a very negative history of being dangerous and not well maintained, but poor conditions for those that are there. So that's its own story. And certainly security around Maduro will be significantly important, because there have been many instances of violence in that facility. Again, he's high profile. They are accustomed to high profile detainees. And that is certainly the case with Maduro and his wife. A 25-page indictment has been returned, and that is part of what you have here. You outlined the four major charges. Now it becomes a part of a much more predictable justice system, where the United States will try to, through the court system, hold Maduro and his wife accountable. There are others who are named in this indictment who have not been captured inside Venezuela, and we don't yet know what will happen with them, including some members of the government. The overarching theme here is that Maduro was interacting with the drug cartels to profit, to line his pockets and those in his regime by clearing the way for the kind of drug running, and that included guns and obviously extensive trafficking of drugs and other kinds of crimes related to that. And the government will have to now prove that case. This is the second indictment. There was one in 2020 as well. This one has been updated to include some additional specifics about his wife, who was a formidable person in the government as well, not just the spouse, but had her own career in the government. So tomorrow we expect potentially the first appearance. He's not required to put in a plea, but it just begins what will be a very long process that, of course, holds very serious penalties for Maduro and his wife.
And Kelly, can you help us understand just nuts and bolts, getting granular here? You talk about the procedural process that will now play out in many ways predictably. Does that mean Nicolás Maduro is going to get a defense attorney, right? Do we know who that person may be? I assume it will be somebody who's publicly appointed at first, but I don't know, Kel.
Well, we're waiting to find out who that is, and that's part of the process. So there's a time clock running on since his detention to his first appearance, so that sort of fuels the need to get this going. Of course, tomorrow's the first day back in sort of regular business post-holidays, so that leads itself to being what you would expect the government to be ready for this. This indictment was sealed, but it happened earlier, so prosecutors are prepared with next steps. It is an interesting question about counsel, because, of course, he's had access to immense resources in his role for which he's being charged, and then he's got to have counsel that is licensed in New York, so we'll have to see what happens with that. But there will be a team of prosecutors, and certainly going up against the Department of Justice is always formidable for any defendant, and this one being so high profile. So among the questions will be, will his counsel challenge the way he was detained? So many things like that will be issues that will play out in the days and weeks to come.
Kelly O'Donnell watching all of it for us. Kel, thank you very much. I want to go now. I think we have Misty Maris, our NBC News legal analyst, who is joining us now. I'm just checking in to see if we have her. We do. Misty, to the point that Kelly is making here, the idea that Maduro may challenge the way that he was brought to the United States to face these charges laid out in this indictment, is that typically a tactic that tends to be successful? I even hesitate to use the word typically, because everything that has happened up to this point has been very atypical. You don't typically see a defendant pulled in a massive military operation from another country that they had previously been leading.
Yeah, absolutely. Nothing routine about this one, but I would expect those challenges to the way that Maduro and his wife were brought to the United States. I would expect challenges trying to get this thrown out at the outset, citing violations of international law, violations of due process, and what we call head of state immunity. So I think those are the likely challenges that will happen once he does retain counsel. And there was an interesting discussion with Kelly. We don't know whether or not a lawyer has either been been appointed or whether or not they have retained counsel. But I would think that this is the type of case that would attract some of the most high-profile constitutional lawyers and minds because of these issues and just the breadth of issues that will come with challenging these indictments.
Misty Maris, plenty to watch. I'm sure we'll talk again tomorrow. Misty, thank you. I appreciate that. I got to get to some breaking news now because there is a new interview, new comments from President Trump just out now in an interview that he gave to The Atlantic, obviously that outlet that it covers a variety of news, including, of course, foreign news, that spoke with President Trump apparently today. This is just published. And in it, President Trump appears to threaten the current Venezuelan vice president, the interim president, Delcy Rodriguez, who we just talked about, with what he describes as a price bigger than what Nicolás Maduro paid. I want to go to our chief international correspondent, Keir Simmons, who's joining us now. Keir, this is just dropped. So this is, we're in kind of developing rolling coverage right here. But looking at some of these comments from President Trump, he is sort of clearly defiant about this strike. He is also talking about Venezuelan leadership. And I want to read the quote here. I think our team has made it, saying that if she doesn't do what's right, Delcy Rodriguez this is, she is going to pay a very big price, probably bigger than Maduro, who is obviously sitting in that detention center in Brooklyn right now. You see the quote here. And Keir, this is part of the question that is on the minds of so many people around the world who are watching this, which is what happens to Venezuela next?
That's right. And we were talking yesterday, weren't we, Halle, about the question of where is and what has happened to Delcy Rodriguez, what is her role going to be, and was a deal done between the Trump administration and Rodriguez? Now, just remember, this is a woman who was vice president under Maduro for many years, since 2018. She is now the interim president, according to Venezuelan authorities. If she's not now, she's being inducted into that position in the coming hours. And so she has kind of dyed in the wool Maduro, if you like, and yet what we had was President Trump suggesting at his news conference yesterday that there was a deal with her. Now, we heard from Secretary Rubio this morning on Meet the Press, and you played some of that and spoke to Kristen about it in that great interview. What he was asked about Delcy Rodriguez, and he didn't answer exactly. What he did suggest, and I'm paraphrasing here, I don't have the quotes in front of me, but what he did suggest was that this was all about ensuring that the leadership in Venezuela acts more in the interests of the United States. So there now does appear to be a question mark because, President Trump, speaking to The Atlantic, may simply have just been riffing, or it may be an indication that they aren't entirely certain which way Delcy Rodriguez is going to go, and that they feel like they need to put more pressure on her. Now, she is, as I mentioned, she is somebody who's worked closely with Maduro. Her brother has been also serving in the Maduro regime. Her father was a very left-wing firebrand, and so she's of that heritage. She's of that politics, if you like. It will be stunning if she shifts, but that is apparently what the Trump administration has been looking for. And all of this goes to that question of what now? That is the real question here. Listen, I think you've been talking about it, Halle, on the show, about potential comparisons to Iraq. Let's be clear, this is not Iraq. You know, at the peak, America had 170,000 troops in Iraq. We talked yesterday, didn't we, about potential comparisons to the Bush operation in Panama in 1989. This is not that either. Panama is smaller, and America had a lot of infrastructure actually around Panama already. Venezuela is much bigger, and there's this fundamental question of how, particularly if it's going to be try to be done remotely, if you like, how is the Trump administration going to get what it wants in Venezuela now that it has carried out this regime change?
Okay, a couple of things here, Keir, as we're sort of looking at this interview. Again, new from President Trump. We heard from him yesterday in that news conference at Mar-a-Lago. This is from today. The Atlantic says it is from this morning. So a couple of things. You mentioned Iraq. He was asked about this by Michael Scherer, the correspondent here, who said, why nation building and regime change in Venezuela is different or would be different than Iraq, to your point about the comparison. And this is what President Trump responded. He said, I didn't do Iraq. That was Bush. You'll have to ask Bush that question because we should have never gone into Iraq. That started the Middle East disaster. All of that said, the president is also making clear in this interview that he is having a different, let's say, filter or perspective on the idea of regime change than perhaps the one that he ran on initially, where he talked about no new wars, no protracted foreign entanglement by America into other countries here. Talking about, and I'm looking for this quote here, the idea basically that it couldn't be worse. He said rebuilding is not a bad thing in Venezuela's case. He said the country's gone to hell. He goes on to say it's a country that's a disaster in every way. And then, Keir, he alludes to potentially Greenland being next. This is something that he sort of toyed with or talked about for a while. It's seen in some corners as perhaps, a troll, more serious in the eyes of others. But the president is suggesting here that after what happened in Venezuela, he said, we do need Greenland. We need it for defense. That he wasn't referring to Greenland at the time when he talked about further U.S. military action, but clearly is not ruling that out either, Keir.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's what he says. Look, the president was asked yesterday at that news conference whether he would be prepared to send boots on the ground into Venezuela. And he said, I'm not afraid of boots on the ground. And what Secretary Rubio said about that, and I'm paraphrasing just this morning on Meet the Press, was, well, of course, President Trump is going to keep his options open. So he's going to say a lot of things. Maybe you want to put the Greenland comments in that bracket. Maybe, but certainly what we do know is that there is a shift in policy by the Trump administration towards focusing on the Western Hemisphere, focusing on America's region, if you like, and that's where the Trump administration is talking about this Venezuela operation as fitting in. So I think, look, I think that these comments from President Trump, in broad terms, kind of wide aperture, need to be viewed as an indication that the roll of the dice, effectively, that the Trump administration has done with Venezuela, that we still don't really know how those dice are going to fall, and we've got days and weeks and months of this ahead.
Keir Simmons. Keir, I'm going to ask you to stand by. I know you're still sifting through that new interview from President Trump. Julie Sirkin's been doing that as well from Mar-a-Lago. You mentioned, as we talked not even 30 minutes ago, Julie, President Trump has spent the morning at the golf course as he is finishing up his holiday break in South Florida. Clearly had some time to get on the phone with this reporter, Michael Scherer from The Atlantic, and talk through sort of what he sees the landscape as Venezuela in next.
Exactly, Hallie. And we also talked about a little moment ago that the president yesterday did not take off the table potential action against other governments and other countries. I mentioned Cuba and Mexico. Well, as you and Keir have been talking about, what about Greenland and Denmark, of course, part of that country? And yesterday I also noticed, just as I'm reading through this Atlantic interview, which the president essentially says we'll have to see what happens in Greenland, basically saying that whatever Secretary of State Rubio meant yesterday by other countries, governments having to watch out, other presidents being on notice. He doesn't elaborate on what Rubio said yesterday, but he did say, in part, saying we do need Greenland, absolutely. He described the island, of course, which is part of Denmark, a NATO ally, a NATO member, as surrounded by Russia and Chinese ships, and that is why he's saying the U.S. has to have a presence there. This isn't the first time he said this. He's been sort of toying with this idea, threatening, sending a warning about Canada in the beginning of his administration, becoming the 51st state, about Greenland as well. Allies have sort of maybe taken this seriously, but mostly snubbed their shoulders at it. Even Republicans on Capitol Hill that I talked to had the same reaction. But if you're reading into what Secretary of State Rubio said yesterday, which is take the president at his word, I think now these governments, certainly after Venezuela, are paying attention. The other thing that I thought was interesting from this interview with The Atlantic is his comments about Delcy Rodriguez, who is the vice president of Venezuela. Now she is the leader since Maduro was taken out of that country. Yesterday I was in that room when President Trump said multiple times that Secretary of State Rubio is in touch with Rodriguez, that she has been cooperating, that at least behind the scenes she's been back-channeling to the U.S. government, that she wants to work with it. But that is not what she said herself hours later since the president made those comments. And in this interview, the president responding to Rodriguez's defiant tone, calling on Maduro and his wife to be returned, saying that he is the only president of Venezuela. Well, the president now to The Atlantic said, if she doesn't do what's right, she is going to pay a very big price, probably bigger than Maduro, is what the president said. And we know that he also said that there would be troops on the ground potentially unless Rodriguez does what the U.S. wants her to do. Hallie?
I think picking up on that, Julie, is critical because what this does is set up the potential for real conflict now between Delcy Rodriguez and President Trump. 24 hours ago, when we were looking at what the president had said after that news conference in Mar-a-Lago, he had suggested, as you point out, that there was some degree of perhaps alignment between U.S. leaders and the remaining leadership in Venezuela almost immediately, within several hours, it became clear that that was not the case with that defiant tone from Delcy Rodriguez. And now this equally defiant response from President Trump, threatening, it sounds like, similar or same or more intense action against her, Julie.
It's hard to imagine what could be more intense than coming in the middle of the night in Caracas, in the capital of the city, and snatching you essentially from your bed, which is what happened to Maduro, and bringing him under the cover of night on a U.S. ship on multiple planes to New York, where he is essentially went from the palace to the perp walk as the president and his team had posted all of those videos. I can't imagine what would be worse that could happen to Delcy Rodriguez. But we also know that President Trump yesterday said they were planning a potential second phase that he said was even greater and even more escalatory than the operation that we saw overnight on Friday. He said that yesterday. Perhaps this is what he's referring to. We also know, Hallie, in just covering the president and watching his remarks in his first administration, in his second administration now, that he tends to deploy this kind of strategy. We saw it with Vladimir Putin last Sunday, where he stood side by side next to Ukrainian leader Zelensky, and he essentially said that President Putin is ready for peace, that he's open to it, that he's never seen him so interested. And then hours later, we saw the Russians try to blame an attack on Putin's residence on Ukraine that was flagged as a false flag operation by the U.S. So it seems like the president has tried to will foreign leaders to do what he wants them to do, whether they are committed to that mission or not. And that is, I suspect, what is happening here in the case of Delcy Rodriguez, but certainly the president today taking a defiant tone. And we know, according to Secretary of State Rubio this morning with Kristen Welker, that there is a military presence there, that they are watching this region closely, and according to the president, that the U.S. will now temporarily run that country. Hallie?
Clearly, President Trump this morning, today, this afternoon, ratcheting up the pressure on Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, currently interim president of Venezuela. Julie, thank you. We've got a lot going on here in the last couple of minutes. A couple of things. First, some new video that is just into us now. Images that we haven't been able to show you before of the capture of Maduro. He is being surrounded by law enforcement. This is when he was being unloaded from this armored vehicle at DEA offices. This is it. And you see Maduro here. Again, this is from last night, late last night, and I believe that is his, from previous pictures, his wife, Celia Flores. But here he comes out. You see he's moving slowly, being pulled out of the back of that vehicle there. And again, this has just been cleared to us here for use to air here at NBC News. As we're seeing this, we are also hearing from Attorney General Pam Bondi, the DOJ. We're also hearing a joint statement now from several of the country's law enforcement agencies. And I want to bring in Kelly O'Donnell and our legal analyst, Misty Maris, for more on that. And Kelly, it's a new online post, and I think it's a paper statement, too, from the DOJ and from the Attorney General, making clear a couple of things. First, that this was, as we heard yesterday, a law enforcement operation, but also, and you see it here, that the Department of War took the lead on the mission. The Attorney General goes on to say that the U.S. pursued every lawful option to try to resolve this matter peacefully. Those opportunities were repeatedly rejected. What is the Attorney General trying to do here, Kelly? Is this about laying out, ahead of these court appearances tomorrow, potentially, a baseline on the legal justification?
Well, it is notable because a statement of this length is not an everyday kind of tweet from the Department of Justice. And this statement, which was posted by the Attorney General, the FBI Director, and so forth, is several paragraphs long. And it does seem to be addressing questions that have been in the public space since this operation took place, in part because there are questions of legality and issues about notification to Congress, which typically would happen with military-type actions. It did not happen until after the mission was underway, and there are questions about that. So by calling it law enforcement, that puts it under the heading of the Department of Justice and the Attorney General. But obviously, she is saying they could not execute this apprehension of fugitives without the Department of Defense, which this administration calls the Department of War. So part of what you see here is a laying out of their justifications. And again, that's somewhat unusual from this administration, but it does, I think, demonstrate there are pressing questions and a need for greater clarity. Typically, if you have one branch that is in the lead, they would have all of the authorities. And we would expect in this case that it was the military. There was an amassing of military assets for weeks. We certainly understood that Maduro and Flores, his wife, had been under indictment for a long time. And so she is really arguing that there were no other options, that they needed to try to apprehend these fugitives, and to do so required the military. It is notable that the people on either side of Maduro, who I don't know about you, but I was struck by his height. I had never realized what a tall man he is. They have DEA jackets, so they are part of the Department of Justice. And so we definitely saw military in the surroundings, but DOJ agency personnel at the elbow, if you will, both figuratively and literally, of Maduro and Flores in this operation. So clearly, before they get to court, they're trying to lay out some of the authorities, the justification, the thinking behind this. And that is part of what is so notable. Obviously, they go on to thank the Department of Defense, as we would call it, the Department of War, as this administration calls it. But the sense that there was no other option is going to be a contested matter. And you certainly also heard the Secretary of State saying today that he's been under indictment, and there are others around the world who are noted figures of various types who have not been secured by the United States. And this administration says, well, it's President Trump being a person of action that they decided to do this. They talk about the months of planning, the specialized teams. There's just so much more to dig in there. Part of that raises questions. What were the authorities? What were the resources in terms of the streams of federal funding to bring about this mission? Where did all of that come from? You can put in one sort of bucket, praise for the military operation that went off, executed well, and still have lots of questions about who authorized this, how was it authorized, what are the legal mechanisms for this to happen. And that's part of what it appears the Attorney General and the others in this multi-agency operation are trying to explain. Hallie?
Kelly O'Donnell, juggling quite a bit this afternoon. What is a busy Sunday for you? Thank you. Let me bring back in Misty Maris, our legal analyst. How do you read this from the Department of Justice, Misty, based on what Kelly just laid out?
I agree with Kelly, and I actually think it's getting ahead of a specific argument that the Department of Justice is forecasting the defense will make. Some of those threshold arguments we were talking about before, Hallie, to challenge this indictment, challenge the way this arrest happened. Part of that is going to be whether or not this is a prosecution, as Pam Bondi has said in this tweet, for a large-scale drug trafficking operation. Basically, there's an indictment that they're bringing the Maduro and his wife to justice to prosecute them for their private criminal acts versus some kind of pretext to actually enact a regime change. And I think some of what President Trump has been saying publicly will be what the Maduro's attorney, when they do have an attorney, will raise as far as the legality of whether or not they should enjoy immunity based on the head of state status. So this is attacking, to me, a very specific legal argument that now Pam Bondi and the Department of Justice is laying out to refocus this on the fact that this is a criminal prosecution for acts that have impacted the United States.
The other piece of this, too, and I wonder the interplay of this. When you looked at there were questions around, even before this extraction, this strike on Venezuela to remove Maduro, there had been questions around the legality of those boat strikes in the Caribbean, as you well know, Misty. And just to remind people, these are the strikes that have been going on for months now that have killed more than 100 alleged narco-terrorists. The administration says more than 100 people. These strikes, they released a video of them. We see it, sort of that night vision looking video, and questions about whether that was legal. The Justice Department, apparently, according to some Washington Post reporting, had suggested that there was legality to that because of a long-standing, or because of an Office of Legal Counsel, OLC, basically, memo that laid this out. Help us understand the interplay between the Justice Department, Congress, the courts here in this situation, and how that works together.
Absolutely. So there's basically, when you're talking about an act of war, that requires congressional approval and would fall outside the president's executive Article 2 powers. So the argument is that to bomb these boats or to go in and facilitate a regime change would require congressional approval. There's a 1989 memo at Department of Justice, as you just said, actually written by Bill Barr, which says that the United States has inherent constitutional authority to order the FBI to take people into custody in a foreign nation, even if it would violate international law. And federal courts have held that that the manner in which a defendant is brought before a U.S. court can still mean that there is jurisdiction, even if it's outside of U.S. soil, and even if it is by force. So all of this interplays together into arguments that I would expect to see about whether or not congressional approval was needed under this circumstance, or does it fall under the president's Article 2 powers relating to issues of foreign intelligence or relating to other diplomatic type issues. So that is the push-pull that we're going to see. And it's a familiar argument, this tension between what is congressional versus what falls under the president's domain.
Ms. DeMaris, we're glad to have you with us today, breaking all this down. Appreciate that. I want to bring in now our senior national security correspondent, Courtney Kube, who's been all over this now since the moment this strike began overnight Friday into Saturday morning. And Court, when you look at this is obviously the Department of Defense was primarily involved in so much of this, along with the intelligence community from our reporting and our understanding. And yet you have Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, and others who have suggested multiple times now that this was primarily a law enforcement operation. How are we supposed to square that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It's a question we've been asking for, 36 hours now. It seems very simple. Just who was the lead agency for this? Now, if you break this entire mission down, we know that the CIA has been involved since at least August, if not before. We know that the U.S. military, the most elite forces in the U.S. military, have been rehearsing and planning for this for months now, including building a mock-up of Maduro's his safe house that they ended up breaking into in the dark of night. And we know that they were done with that planning and that they were ready to move forward this mission in December. But at its heart, this is all about enforcing a law enforcement mission here. So the military has unique capabilities like the strikes that we saw them take in advance, or essentially shaping for this operation. So think about it. They're sending in a combination of U.S. military and law enforcement officials to go into that compound where Maduro and his wife were, to extract them and take them out, in order to set conditions that would be safe enough for them to carry out that mission, the safest they could possibly make it. The U.S. military took preemptive strikes against the Venezuelan military. So they did things, we know some of it from President Trump yesterday, frankly, like cut off electricity and jam systems, jam communications, and then take kinetic strikes, actually blow things up as a way to make it safer for that extraction team. Those are the unique capabilities that law enforcement officials wouldn't have the ability to do. That's why the military was brought in here. But again, it does not, even if the preponderance of officials, of bodies who were involved in this on the U.S. side were military, it doesn't mean that it was a military operation. And candidly, Trump administration officials are really blurring the lines here about who was really in charge of this.
So then what is the current status, and maybe the status in the next 24, 48 hours, a week or whatever, of troops in the region here? Because on the one hand, Marco Rubio says troops will remain in the region as he put it today, leverage. On the other hand, you've had the president saying troops are not on the ground currently in Venezuela, but the president also hasn't ruled that out, Courtney. It seems like it's an incredibly fluid situation. Is that what you're hearing from sources that you're talking to?
Yeah, and it's so interesting to hear the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor talk about U.S. troops as leverage. Candidly, it would normally be considered as deterrence, right? So they would put just for decades, this is what we hear about, is a U.S. military presence in a region is often just there for deterrence, right? Leverage is just such a fascinating turn of how they're using the military in this Trump administration. At this point, we have no indication that the U.S. is going to draw down any of those forces. And it's a combination of things. It is that deterrence, which they believe the military provides against what this all, we were told, started about, and that was about drugs in the region, trying to stop the flow of any kind of drugs. The majority of the ones coming from Venezuela are not coming to the United States, but stopping the flow of drugs out of Venezuela. But what's clear is that this is also about pressuring Venezuela, pressuring initially the Maduro regime and now the new Venezuelan government, the U.S. military being used for that. I also wouldn't expect any let up on the gas of what the military we were told was really there for, Operation Southern Spear. And that is supposed to be, at its heart, an operation that is supposed to be stopping the flow of narcotics in the region. I wouldn't be surprised, Hallie, if we continue to see strikes on alleged drug boats coming in and out of the area. There have been over 30 of them since the first of September. More than 100 people have been killed. Another thing that's been really fascinating as we've watched this unfold over the last day and a half is when talking about this operation yesterday down at Mar-a-Lago, some of the analogy that or the comparisons that were made by the Trump administration officials to those boat strikes. In some ways, they're using the same legal justification for the strikes as they used for this mission into Caracas.
Courtney Kube, a lot to unpack there. We'll look for more of your reporting on NBC News, on NBCNews.com, and then tonight on Nightly News. Thanks, Court. I want to bring in for more General Wesley Clark, former Supreme Allied Commander for NATO. General Clark, it's good to see you again. Thank you for being on with us.
I was also the Southcom commander.
You know this region well. You're beating me to the punch on that. So let me start there then. Let's go there. You know this area. You know this region. When Secretary of State Rubio talks about U.S. troops in the region as leverage, how do you understand that? How should we be thinking about that?
Well, I think the hammer is going to fall on several countries down here, and it's just a question of how it's played. Cuba certainly is at risk, and the president of Colombia has been put on notice. So I think the administration's working to cut out the leadership of those countries that don't seem to support the United States and President Trump. So he's got Argentina on his side. He's got El Salvador on his side, certainly. He's got Chile on his side now. He doesn't have Brazil. He doesn't have Colombia. I think he has Peru on his side. So I think this is all about the national security strategy and using force to try to set up the strategy. But the problem with this is that there's 450 million people down there, and they're not all inclined to go along with the United States, especially when we talk about taking oil and putting U.S. money into oil. This has been the proverbial curse of the United States, is to be blamed for going in someplace and trying to make money off of it. And so I think that we're in a really, really uncertain period right here. And it's possible that a lot of chaos is going to be released into this hemisphere.
What would it take to mitigate that chaos and uncertainty?
I think you've got to have a moral purpose above making money and seizing oil for what you're doing. So there hasn't been any discussion about democracy. All that jubilation in South Florida about getting rid of a dictator and so forth. And looks like we're trying to just keep them in power, get a hold of the oil. Maybe there's some geopolitics here. Certainly the Russians and Chinese won't like it with the demonstration of U.S. military power. But if we're just sustaining autocratic regimes or putting autocratic regimes in place that are friendly to us, the policy doesn't have any durability, and it will invite not only chaos there, but retaliation in the United States through terrorist actions and other things here.
General, you say that the Trump administration is using force to set up the national security strategy, right? The use of force in order to get to that end result. That is a real paradigm shift from the way that typically the U.S. has seen its role in the Western Hemisphere. It's
a huge paradigm shift. You know, we've been trying for 100 years to get over the 1920s when we intervened in Central America to save banana plantations, or the 1930s when we put the Marines into Haiti and we didn't get much accomplished there. We've worked with the Organization of American States, the Washington Office on Latin America. We've put diplomats in there. We've done the Summit of the Americas. We've tried to cultivate friendship through the Inter-American Development Bank and many other things to try to reach out to Latin America. This turns this all upside down, the way it's been portrayed, and especially yesterday in the discussion of oil and then the back and forth with the vice president of Venezuela. It makes it look very, very antique. This is a throwback to the late 19th century when the United States lusted after the real estate in Cuba, and we invaded Cuba only to find it was too hot to hang on to.
General Wesley Clark, it is a real privilege for us to have your expertise and your analysis with us. Please come back. I hope we talk again, I'm sure, in the days to come. Appreciate it. Thank you. I want to bring in now our NBC News foreign correspondent, Raf Sanchez, who has posted up for us overseas in London. And Raf, this is a moment that the world is watching. They are watching closely for the reasons that the general laid out, the questions of uncertainty in the days and hours ahead.
Yeah, absolutely, Hallie. This is all playing out in the Western Hemisphere, but as you said, is being watched around the world. Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. There are major questions about international law at stake here. So this is a topic of global conversation. Here in Europe, the NATO allies are being fairly cautious. They don't want to anger President Trump. Few of them are sorry to see the back of Nicolás Maduro. The European Union joins the United States in declaring him an illegitimate president after he stole the last election in Venezuela. But on the other hand, there are major concerns about international law. These are European leaders who every day are talking about international law in the context of Ukraine. They are saying that Vladimir Putin illegally invaded a sovereign country, and now they are trying to explain why that is different from the United States attacking a neighboring country and capturing its leader. I want to read you just a little bit of a statement from the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer. It captures a little bit of that attempt at balance. The British Prime Minister saying the UK has long supported a transition of power in Venezuela. We regarded Maduro as an illegitimate president, and at the same time saying that they reiterate their support for international law. Hallie.
Raf Sanchez live for us in London. Raf, it's good to see you. Thank you. I want to bring in now somebody who knows this region well, who understands it, and who has been covering it for a long time. And that is, let me say, Andrew Latham, who is a professor of international relations at Macalester College. We're working to get him up and with us here because, as you've heard, there are real questions now over the next 48 hours, over the next week, month, et cetera, both in the very short term and in the near short term, about what happens in Venezuela, especially with these new comments from President Trump about Venezuelan leadership, as we've been reporting here over the course of the last 30 minutes. Let me bring in, too, on the other piece of this, which is the oil, and you heard General Clark talking about this, somebody who also understands that, John Kilduff, partner at Again Capital, which provides investment advisory in energy and oil. John, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. Good to be with you.
The oil piece of this has been from the jump, something we've heard about from President Trump after the capture of Nicolás Maduro as he was being brought back to New York. Help us understand what happens from here, because the president has said that the U.S. will take a heavy hand in rebuilding oil infrastructure in Venezuela.
Well, what should happen from here is that the remnants of a once great national oil company, PDVSA, is there. And it's there, and it exists partly because of immense investment by two of our U.S. oil companies, Chevron and ExxonMobil. Both of those companies, we're talking about what's right and wrong here to a degree, they both invested over $1 billion each in PDVSA and the Venezuelan oil economy. And they were both taken from them by the Chavez and Maduro regimes. So they are the ones that were left really stripped of major investments in a company, in a country that provides key source of oil to the U.S. Gulf Coast refining companies, or they could, because the Venezuelan oil is a special blend. It's very what we call heavy and sour. It has to be processed. But our U.S. Gulf Coast refiners were specifically built to refine that oil into U.S. gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel. So it was an important source of supply to the U.S. over the decades. That industry has fallen into terrific disrepair. It won't take much to get a slug of oil back onto the market. It should lower oil prices, lower gasoline prices for the U.S. consumer.
John, in a nutshell, what does this mean for oil and gas prices here in America?
They should be going lower. They could be going a lot lower if the administration handles the rebuild rapidly, quickly, and effectively.
John Kilduff, we're glad to have you. Thank you very much for your expertise and for being with us today. Let me go back now to Professor Andrew Latham, Professor of International Relations at Macalester College. Professor, good to see you again. Let me ask you about these newest comments from President Trump, suggesting that if Delcy Rodriguez, the, of course, vice president, now the interim president of Venezuela, does not essentially cooperate with the United States, she could pay what the president describes as a bigger price than Maduro. How does that conflict point create a domino effect now in the region?
Well, it looks like President Trump is going to keep applying pressure. Whoever rises to the top, once there's another act of decapitation that takes place, trying to put pressure on them to do a deal which is favorable to and advantageous to the United States. It all turns really ultimately on how resilient and robust that regime is, and who the person at the top of that pyramid is, who's calling the shots. If they are confident that they have the support of the other elements of the regime, they'll resist President Trump, and they'll turn perhaps to Russia or China for various kinds of support in that. If, on the other hand, that regime begins to fracture and fragment, then the person at the top, the apex of that, the ultimate shot caller, is not going to be in a position to resist Trump. And then we might see some accommodation. It really wouldn't take much, by the way, for Venezuela to get in line to denationalize the oil industry and to minimize the influence of China and Russia. At the end of the day, all they talk about narco trafficking notwithstanding, those are the big issues. The extra hemispheric influence of Russia and China, and access to this particular kind of crude.
Professor Latham, it is super interesting. I got to have you back. I know we're out of time for today, but please come back. More to talk about as we look ahead to that court appearance tomorrow for Nicolás Maduro. As thanks to all of our contributors and reporters here, and a thanks to you for watching. More coverage coming up later today, right here on NBC News.
This Sunday, captured. U.S. Special Operation Forces launch an attack in Venezuela, capturing President Nicolás Maduro and his wife, flying them out of the country and charging Maduro with drug trafficking crimes.
We're going to run the country until such time